Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe, a place where we learn English through real-world topics, global issues, and calm, thoughtful conversations. And today we are very happy that you are spending your time with us, because the topic we are going to discuss is not only important for understanding the world around us, but also very useful for improving your English listening, vocabulary, and critical thinking skills in a natural and meaningful way.
Yes, dear listeners, we are truly glad to have you here, because this podcast is created especially for people who want to understand complex global topics in simple English, without fear, without confusion, and without exaggerated language. And today's discussion will help you follow international news more confidently, while also training your ears to longer English sentences and clear explanations that are easy to follow step by step.
The topic of today's episode is World War III or Strategic Tension, how Trump, Putin, and Zelensky are shaping the global crisis. And you may have noticed that these words appear very often in news headlines, social media posts, and online discussions, where people are asking serious questions about the future of global peace, international security, and the direction in which the world seems to be moving at this moment.
Many people feel concerned when they hear these discussions because the phrase World War III carries a heavy emotional meaning, especially when combined with images of conflict, political disagreements, and strong speeches from world leaders. But what we want to do in this podcast is slow everything down, remove unnecessary fear, and help you understand the difference between dramatic headlines and the actual geopolitical realities that shape global politics today.
This topic is important because we are living in a time when information moves very fast, opinions spread quickly, and emotional reactions often come before careful analysis. So learning how to listen, understand, and think clearly about global tension helps not only your English skills, but also your ability to remain calm, informed, and thoughtful when you hear about international conflicts and political disagreements.
In today's episode, we will talk about three major political figures who often appear in global news, namely Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Volodymyr Zelensky. But we will not describe them as heroes or villains, because real-world politics is rarely that simple. And our goal is to explain their roles, decisions, and influence in a balanced and educational way that helps you understand how leadership affects global relationships.
It is also important to say clearly that global tension does not automatically mean global war, because countries often compete, disagree, and even confront each other politically or economically without moving into full-scale war. And understanding this difference is one of the most valuable lessons you can learn when following international news in English.
For English learners, this kind of topic is extremely useful because it introduces formal vocabulary, structured arguments, and real-life language used by journalists, analysts, and international organizations. And by listening carefully to long discussions like this one, you slowly train your brain to understand English naturally, without translating every word in your head.
Before we go deeper into today's discussion, dear listeners, we would kindly like to ask you for a small support, because it truly helps our channel grow and reach more learners around the world. So if you find this podcast useful, please like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and turn on notifications so you do not miss our future English learning episodes.
We would also love to hear from you, because this channel is a global community of learners. So please tell us in the comments which country you are listening from, and share your thoughts about today's topic. Because reading different opinions helps everyone learn not only English, but also how people from different parts of the world see global events.
Your comments, questions, and ideas are always welcome here, and they help us create better content for you, so feel free to express your opinion politely and thoughtfully, because respectful discussion is an important part of learning both language and global awareness.
Now that we have clearly introduced today's topic and explained why it matters, we are ready to move forward and explore the global context step by step, using calm language, clear explanations, and a learning-focused approach that will help you improve your English while understanding the world more deeply.
So let us begin this journey together by first understanding what people really mean when they talk about global tension and why the world is paying so much attention to these international developments today. When people hear the phrase World War III, they often imagine something sudden and extreme. But to truly understand whether such a thing is possible, we first need to understand what a world war actually means in historical terms, because words like war, conflict, and crisis are often used loosely online, even though they describe very different levels of international tension.
That is exactly why history is so important here, Adam, because when we look at World War I and World War II, we see that they were not just large conflicts, but truly global events involving many countries across different continents, with formal declarations of war, massive military alliances, and direct fighting between major powers over a long period of time.
World War I, which began in 1914, started after a political crisis in Europe, but it became a world war because existing alliances pulled many countries into the fighting, turning a regional conflict into a global one, and the same pattern appeared again in World War II, which started in 1939 and expanded rapidly as powerful nations became directly involved in large-scale military operations around the world.
So when historians describe a world war, they usually mean a conflict that has three main features, which are wide international involvement, direct military fighting between major global powers, and a scale of destruction that affects not only soldiers, but entire societies, economies, and political systems across multiple regions of the world.
This brings us to an important question for today, which is why current global conflicts, even though they are serious and tragic, do not automatically mean that the world is entering another world war, because many of the key historical conditions that defined past world wars are not fully present in the same way right now.
One key condition that often leads to a world war is the existence of rigid alliances, where countries are legally or politically committed to fight together if one member is attacked. But in today's world, although alliances still exist, many countries are extremely careful about how and when they become directly involved in military action, especially when nuclear-armed states are concerned.
Another important factor is direct military involvement, because in a true world war, major powers fight each other openly with their own armies, navies, and air forces, whereas in many modern conflicts, powerful countries try to avoid direct confrontation and instead rely on diplomacy, economic pressure, or limited forms of support that stop short of full-scale war.
This careful behavior is linked to the concept of escalation, which means a situation becoming more intense or dangerous over time. And while escalation is something that governments constantly try to manage and control, it does not automatically lead to global war, especially when leaders understand the severe consequences of uncontrolled military expansion.
Social media, however, often presents escalation as something immediate and unavoidable because dramatic language spreads faster than careful analysis, and this is why we see so many posts claiming that the world is already on the edge of World War III, even when experts and international organizations are using much more cautious and measured language.
Another misunderstanding comes from the word global, because people sometimes think that if a conflict affects global markets, energy prices, or international politics, it must be a world war. But in reality, global impact does not always mean global fighting, since modern economies are deeply connected and can be influenced by events far away without direct military involvement.
The idea of intervention is also often misunderstood, because intervention can mean many things, such as diplomatic talks, humanitarian aid, economic sanctions, or political pressure, and not every form of intervention involves sending soldiers or starting a war, even though social media discussions often ignore these important differences.
For English learners, this is a very useful moment to focus on vocabulary, because words like conflict, alliance, escalation, global, and intervention appear frequently in international news, and understanding their precise meaning helps you follow serious discussions without feeling lost or emotionally overwhelmed by strong headlines.
It is also important to remember that modern global politics is shaped by lessons learned from past world wars, and many international systems, agreements, and diplomatic channels were created specifically to prevent another global catastrophe, which is why countries often communicate behind the scenes even when they disagree publicly.
So when you hear people online confidently predicting a world war, it is helpful to pause and ask whether the historical conditions truly match those of past world wars, or whether the situation is better described as ongoing tension, competition, and strategic rivalry, rather than an unstoppable march toward global conflict.
Understanding this difference does not mean ignoring real suffering or real danger, but it does mean approaching global news with balance, patience, and critical thinking, which are essential skills not only for global citizens, but also for English learners who want to understand complex topics clearly and calmly.
By learning to separate historical facts from emotional reactions, and by understanding how language shapes perception, you become more confident in both your English ability and your understanding of the world, which is exactly the goal of listening to long, thoughtful discussions like this one.
With this clearer understanding of what a world war truly means, we are now better prepared to look at today's global situation realistically, without exaggeration or fear, and to explore how modern political leaders and international systems try to manage tension in a very different world than the one that existed a century ago. When we talk about global security in recent years, it is impossible to ignore the influence of Donald Trump, because whether people agree with him or not, his words, decisions, and leadership style have clearly affected how countries think about defense, alliances, and responsibility, especially in relation to NATO, Europe, and the broader international security system.
That is true, Adam. And to understand Trump's influence clearly, we need to separate emotion from analysis, because global security is shaped not only by actions, but also by language, expectations, and trust between countries. And Trump's approach often challenged long-standing assumptions that many allies had taken for granted for decades.
One of the most important areas where Trump had a strong impact was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a military alliance created after World War II to provide collective defense, meaning that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all members, and for many European countries, NATO has been a central pillar of their security.
Trump repeatedly questioned whether NATO members were contributing enough financially to their own defense, and while this concern was not entirely new in American politics, his direct and public way of expressing it made many European leaders uncomfortable, because security alliances traditionally rely on quiet diplomacy rather than public criticism.
From Trump's perspective, he argued that the United States was carrying too much of the financial and military burden, and he wanted European allies to spend more on defense, which he presented as a matter of fairness and responsibility. But the way this message was communicated created uncertainty about how committed the United States truly was to the alliance.
This is a very good example of how leadership style affects international relations, because even when the underlying policy goal is shared by other leaders, the tone, timing, and language used can change how that message is received, especially when it involves sensitive topics like national security and mutual defense.
Another important point for English learners to understand is the difference between strong rhetoric and actual military policy, because Trump was known for using bold, sometimes dramatic language, especially in speeches, interviews, and social media. But strong words do not always lead directly to immediate military action.
In many cases, Trump's administration continued existing defense commitments, maintained military alliances, and avoided direct large-scale wars with other major powers, which shows that public statements and official policy do not always move in the same direction, even though headlines often focus only on the most dramatic quotes.
This difference between rhetoric and policy is very important when listening to international news in English, because political leaders often use language strategically to influence public opinion, negotiate from a position of strength, or signal dissatisfaction, without necessarily intending to change military strategy overnight.
However, even when actual policies remain relatively stable, repeated strong statements can still have real consequences. Because allies may start to question long-term commitments, rivals may test boundaries, and global markets may react to perceived instability, which is why Trump's communication style often created uncertainty in international relations.
Uncertainty is a key word here, because global security depends heavily on predictability, meaning that countries feel safer when they can reasonably expect how others will behave. And when a leader sends mixed or unexpected signals, it becomes harder for allies and rivals to plan their own policies with confidence.
This uncertainty does not automatically lead to conflict, but it can increase tension, especially when combined with existing disagreements, regional conflicts, or competition between major powers. And this is why Trump's influence is often discussed in terms of communication and perception, rather than only military strength.
For English learners, this section is a great opportunity to focus on political tone and intention, because phrases can sound aggressive, cooperative, critical, or negotiative, depending on how they are framed, and learning to recognize these differences helps you understand what leaders may be trying to achieve beyond the literal meaning of their words.
Diplomatic language, for example, is often indirect and careful, while Trump's style was more direct and confrontational. And understanding this contrast helps learners avoid misunderstanding political messages, especially when translating ideas into their own language or forming opinions based on English language news sources.
It is also important to remember that global security is not shaped by one person alone, because institutions, advisors, allies, and international systems all play a role, even though leaders like Trump can strongly influence the tone and direction of debates through their personal style and public communication.
So when we analyze Trump's influence on global security, we are not saying that he caused global conflict or global peace by himself, but rather that his approach changed how countries talk to each other, how alliances were discussed publicly, and how uncertainty became a more visible part of international relations.
By understanding these distinctions, English learners can follow political discussions more calmly and accurately, without reacting only to headlines or emotional language, and instead focus on context, intention, and long-term patterns in global security.
This ability to listen carefully, analyze language, and separate tone from policy is a powerful skill, not only for improving English, but also for becoming a more informed global citizen who can understand complex political situations without fear or confusion.
With this clearer understanding of Trump's influence on alliances, rhetoric, and international expectations, we are now ready to look at how other global leaders approach security from very different historical and political perspectives. To understand today's global tension more clearly, we now need to look carefully at Russia's strategic thinking, because Russia's actions and decisions are deeply connected to how it understands security, borders, and influence, and without this background, it is very easy to misunderstand why Russian leaders, especially Vladimir Putin, behave the way they do on the international stage.
That is a very important point, Adam, because Russia's view of security is shaped by history, geography, and past experiences, and unlike countries that are protected by oceans or distant borders, Russia has long believed that physical space and surrounding regions play a critical role in national survival, which strongly influences how it thinks about threats and protection.
From Russia's perspective, borders are not only lines on a map, but strategic buffers, meaning areas that provide distance between Russia and potential enemies. And this way of thinking developed over centuries during invasions, wars, and periods of instability. which explains why Russian leaders place such strong importance on controlling or influencing neighboring regions.
This brings us to the idea of sovereignty, which means a country's right to control its own political decisions and territory. Because while Russia strongly emphasizes its own sovereignty, it also expects neighboring countries to consider Russian security concerns, creating tension when those neighbors choose different political or military paths.
Vladimir Putin's long-term strategy is often described as an effort to restore Russia's influence on the global stage, not necessarily by recreating past empires, but by ensuring that Russia is respected as a major power whose interests cannot be ignored, especially in regions close to its borders.
One of the central reasons Russia sees NATO as a threat is not simply military strength, but expansion, because NATO moving closer to Russia's borders is viewed by Russian leaders as reducing strategic depth and increasing vulnerability, even though NATO describes itself as a defensive alliance rather than an aggressive one.
This difference in perception is crucial, because while NATO members argue that countries freely choose to join the alliance for protection, Russia interprets the same actions as a loss of influence and a potential danger, showing how the same event can be understood very differently depending on historical memory and security culture.
Here, it is helpful to explain the difference between a defense strategy and expansion fears, because a defense strategy focuses on protecting existing territory and preventing attacks, while expansion fears arise when a country believes that another power is slowly surrounding or limiting its freedom to act, even without direct military confrontation.
Russia often presents its actions as defensive, aimed at protecting national security and preventing future threats, while critics argue that these actions look like attempts to expand control or influence. And this disagreement is at the heart of many global debates about Russia's role in current international tensions.
Another important concept for English learners here is influence, which means the ability to affect decisions or behavior without direct control, because Russia uses influence in many forms, including political relationships, economic connections, cultural ties, and historical narratives that shape how other countries see Russia and themselves.
Russia also uses military power as a signal rather than only as a weapon, because troop movements, exercises, and demonstrations of capability are often intended to send messages to other governments, showing strength and readiness without necessarily leading to open conflict.
Energy is another major tool of Russian power, because Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers, and gas and oil exports give it economic leverage, especially in regions that depend heavily on these resources, which means energy policy often becomes part of broader diplomatic and strategic discussions.
Diplomacy plays a quieter but equally important role, because Russia participates in international negotiations, regional agreements, and global forums, where it seeks recognition of its interests and attempts to shape outcomes through dialogue, pressure, and negotiation, rather than constant confrontation.
When conflicts escalate, countries often respond with sanctions, which are economic and political restrictions designed to influence behavior without direct military action. And Russia has experienced extensive sanctions in recent years, shaping its economy, foreign policy choices, and relationships with other global powers.
Sanctions are closely connected to the idea of deterrence, which means discouraging certain actions by increasing the cost, because the goal is not punishment alone, but changing future behavior by making certain choices less attractive or more risky.
For English learners, these words, sovereignty, influence, deterrence, and sanctions, are extremely important because they appear frequently in serious news discussions, policy reports, and international speeches, and understanding them helps listeners follow global debates with much greater confidence.
It is also important to understand that Russia's strategic calculations are not made in isolation, because leaders constantly react to the actions of other countries, meaning global security is shaped by interaction, misunderstanding, response, and counter-response, rather than one-sided decisions.
This is why experts often describe today's global situation as a cycle of action and reaction, where each side believes it is responding defensively, even while increasing tension. And recognizing this pattern helps learners avoid simple explanations that blame only one side.
By viewing Russia's strategy through the lens of history, security concerns, and long-term goals, rather than emotion or headlines, we can better understand why global tension persists and why solutions are often slow, complex, and difficult.
For English learners, listening to this kind of careful explanation builds not only vocabulary and comprehension, but also patience and analytical thinking, which are essential skills when engaging with global issues in a second language.
With this deeper understanding of Russia's strategic calculations, we are now better prepared to look at how other leaders respond to these pressures and how their decisions shape the broader global crisis we are discussing in this episode. When we look at Ukraine's situation, it is important to understand that Ukraine is a relatively smaller country positioned geographically between powerful political and military forces, and this location has placed it in a difficult position where decisions made by larger neighboring powers directly affect its security, economy, and future, creating a constant challenge between maintaining independence and responding to pressure from outside influences.
Ukraine's position between major powers means that its leaders must constantly balance national sovereignty with survival, because being located between competing security systems often forces smaller states to make difficult choices, where neutrality becomes harder to maintain. Alliances become more important, and every political decision carries serious long-term consequences for the country's stability and people.
Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership during this crisis is often discussed internationally, and it is helpful to explain his role calmly and respectfully, because he entered politics as a non-traditional leader and then faced extraordinary circumstances that required him to communicate clearly, make rapid decisions, and represent Ukraine on the global stage under intense pressure.
Zelensky's leadership style during the conflict has focused heavily on communication and visibility, because in moments of national crisis, leaders are expected not only to manage military and political decisions, but also to maintain public morale, reassure citizens, and explain Ukraine's position to the international community in a way that encourages understanding rather than confusion.
One major reason Ukraine seeks Western support is directly connected to cause and consequence, because when a country faces security threats that it cannot manage alone, it naturally looks for partnerships that provide economic assistance, political backing, and defensive support, especially when those partnerships promise recognition of sovereignty and long-term stability.
From Ukraine's perspective, cooperation with Western countries is seen as a way to strengthen national defense and political independence, while also integrating more deeply into international systems that offer economic opportunity and diplomatic protection, showing how security choices are often connected to broader goals beyond immediate military concerns.
However, seeking external support also brings responsibility, because alliances influence policy decisions, limit certain options, and create expectations about behavior, meaning that Ukraine's leadership must carefully consider how each request for assistance affects not only short-term survival, but also future political flexibility.
The human cost of long-term conflict is one of the most serious consequences to understand, because beyond political debates and military strategies, ordinary people experience disruption to daily life, economic hardship, displacement, and emotional stress, which reminds us that conflicts are never only about territory or power, but about human well-being.
Politically, long-lasting conflict places enormous pressure on democratic institutions, public trust, and national unity, because governments must operate under emergency conditions while still maintaining legitimacy, transparency, and accountability, which is an extremely difficult balance to achieve during prolonged instability.
For English learners, This topic is especially useful for practicing expressions of cause, consequence, and responsibility, because phrases such as because of, as a result, this leads to, and this creates responsibility appear naturally in discussions about leadership, conflict, and international decision-making.
Understanding how to explain why events happen, what results they produce, and who is responsible allows learners to speak and think more clearly about global issues, while also improving their ability to follow serious discussions in English without feeling overwhelmed by complexity.
By examining Ukraine's situation through geography, leadership, and human impact, learners can better understand how global politics affects real countries and real people, while also developing the language skills needed to describe difficult topics calmly, respectfully, and accurately.
This balanced understanding prepares us to move forward in the discussion, because once we understand Ukraine's position and leadership challenges, we can better evaluate how international responses shape the broader global tension we are exploring throughout this podcast. In today's world, one of the most powerful forces shaping our perception of global events is the media, because headlines and news reports often use dramatic language, striking images, and urgent wording that can immediately trigger fear and anxiety, even when the actual situation is more complex and nuanced, which makes it essential for learners to understand how language influences perception and emotional response.
That is exactly right, Adam, because the way news stories are presented often emphasizes the most extreme possibilities rather than the most probable outcomes, which means that audiences may feel the world is on the brink of disaster, when, in reality, careful analysis by experts presents a more measured, step-by-step understanding of events, highlighting the difference between genuine risk and sensationalized presentation.
For example, phrases like World War III are used frequently because they attract clicks and attention, which is a natural part of the digital media economy. But these phrases are often misleading because they focus on hypothetical scenarios and worst-case outcomes rather than explaining the actual dynamics of international relations, alliances, and strategic calculations.
From a language learning perspective, this provides an excellent opportunity to explore words such as narrative, which refers to the way a story is told, including the sequence, emphasis, and interpretation of events, because understanding the narrative of a news article helps learners distinguish between the story being constructed and the factual details that underlie it.
Another key term is perception, which means how events, actions, or statements are understood or interpreted by individuals or groups, because media outlets can shape public perception by choosing which facts to highlight, which experts to quote, and which images or videos to display, often creating a sense of urgency or danger that may not fully reflect reality.
The difference between analysis and sensationalism is critical to recognize, because analysis involves careful examination of facts, context, and consequences, while sensationalism emphasizes dramatic, shocking, or emotionally charged elements to attract attention. And being able to distinguish these approaches is an essential skill for learners who want to follow global news in English critically.
Sensational headlines are often short, emotionally charged, and filled with strong adjectives or alarming verbs, whereas analytical articles provide background, explanation, and multiple perspectives, which is why learning to identify signal words, tone, and structure in English news can help learners understand not only the language, but also the credibility of the source.
Credibility is another vocabulary word that is essential for learners because it refers to the trustworthiness or reliability of information. And evaluating credibility means considering the reputation of the news organization, the expertise of sources, the evidence provided, and whether alternative viewpoints are acknowledged, all of which are key to reading and listening critically.
When audiences encounter dramatic headlines repeatedly, it can create a cycle of fear and anxiety, because humans naturally pay more attention to threatening information, a phenomenon often called negativity bias. And this psychological effect explains why sensational language is so effective at drawing attention, but can distort public understanding of complex geopolitical situations.
For English learners, this is an important lesson because media not only teaches new vocabulary, but also models sentence structure, phrasing, and rhetorical devices. And by analyzing how stories are written, learners can develop critical thinking, improve comprehension, and understand how language can influence emotion and perception simultaneously.
Another element to consider is exaggeration, which occurs when facts or possibilities are presented as more extreme than they are, often to make a story seem urgent or shocking, and learners can practice recognizing exaggeration by comparing headlines with the body of the article, or by cross-referencing multiple reputable sources to identify the actual level of risk or significance.
It is also helpful to understand that social media amplifies this effect, because algorithms often prioritize content that provokes strong emotional reactions, which means that dramatic language spreads quickly, creating a perception that extreme outcomes are more likely than they truly are. And learners need to approach such content with skepticism and careful reading strategies.
When learners practice reading news critically, they can ask questions such as, who wrote this story? What evidence is presented? Are alternative viewpoints included? Does the headline accurately reflect the article? This approach not only improves English comprehension, but also teaches important life skills for navigating an information-rich world without becoming overwhelmed or misled.
Another technique is to pay attention to the narrative structure of a news story, because understanding the sequence of events, the actors involved, and the causal relationships between actions allows learners to distinguish between facts, opinions, and speculation, which is especially important when analyzing reports on sensitive topics like international conflicts and strategic tension.
For example, when media reports about Russia, Ukraine, or other global actors, headlines often simplify complex situations into binary terms such as aggressor and defender, or crisis and escalation, which may overlook nuanced strategies, historical context, and diplomatic measures. So learners should focus on full sentences and explanatory paragraphs rather than relying only on headlines.
By focusing on the body of the article or listening to complete news segments, learners can improve their understanding of vocabulary, sentence structure, cause and effect relationships, and conditional language, all of which are essential for following serious discussions about global events and for expressing informed opinions in English. Another useful practice is to compare multiple sources because this exposes learners to different word choices, tones, and emphases, helping them understand how different media outlets construct narratives and influence perception. And this also encourages vocabulary expansion as learners encounter synonyms, idiomatic expressions, and context-specific phrases repeatedly. It is also valuable to recognize how images, video clips, and social media comments contribute to the overall effect of news, because visual and interactive elements often amplify fear or urgency, and understanding the combined impact of language and imagery helps learners critically evaluate both written and spoken English materials in a global context.
Learning to analyze news in this way also improves listening skills, because many podcasts, interviews, and live news reports use formal vocabulary, transitional phrases, and logical argumentation that require attentive listening, and by focusing on meaning rather than reacting emotionally, learners develop confidence in understanding complex English discussions.
Ultimately, the goal of this section is to help learners understand that media influence is not inherently negative, but it requires careful attention, critical thinking, and vocabulary awareness. Because by recognizing exaggeration, narrative construction, and differences between analysis and sensationalism, learners can follow global events thoughtfully and communicate their own ideas accurately.
By practicing these skills consistently, learners will be able to read or listen to news about international conflicts, alliances, and strategic decisions without becoming anxious or confused, and they will gain the ability to summarize events, discuss possible outcomes, and explain causes and consequences using precise formal English.
In conclusion, understanding how media shapes perception through dramatic language, recognizing the difference between analysis and sensationalism, evaluating credibility, and identifying exaggeration are all crucial steps in developing both language proficiency and informed global awareness, making English learning a tool not only for communication, but also for critical thinking in a world full of information.
When people hear discussions about global conflicts today, it is natural to ask whether the world is actually moving toward war, or if tensions are being carefully managed behind the scenes, because while media coverage often highlights dramatic possibilities, most international relations experts emphasize the role of ongoing diplomacy, negotiation, and multilateral channels that aim to prevent uncontrolled escalation, showing that tension does not automatically equal war.
That is correct, Adam. And an important way to understand this is to look at diplomatic channels, which include both formal and informal communication between governments. Because leaders use these channels to express concerns, clarify intentions, and find compromises. And although public statements may sound strong or threatening, these private conversations often keep conflicts under control and reduce the risk of miscalculation.
International organizations, such as the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other regional bodies, play a vital role in this process because they provide neutral platforms for discussion, offer monitoring and verification mechanisms, and coordinate responses that help countries address disputes peacefully. And while their actions may not always be visible to the public, they contribute significantly to stability.
In addition to formal channels, back-channel diplomacy has historically been a key tool for avoiding direct confrontation, because confidential discussions between officials, advisors, or even former leaders allow governments to test ideas, negotiate compromises, and clarify intentions without the pressure of public scrutiny, which reduces the chance of escalation caused by misunderstanding or miscommunication.
Another reason major powers often avoid direct confrontation is the principle of mutual deterrence, because even though countries may have conflicts of interest, the potential cost of full-scale war, especially between nuclear-armed states, is so high that leaders calculate carefully before taking any action that could trigger a direct clash, showing that strategic caution is often more influential than public rhetoric.
This careful balance can be described as controlled tension, which means that countries maintain a level of competition, disagreement, or military preparedness without allowing these tensions to spiral into full-scale conflict, because leaders deliberately manage communication, troop movements, and international agreements to create predictability while protecting national interests.
For English learners, understanding contrast structures is especially useful here, because situations in global politics are rarely simple, and sentences like, "Although leaders speak firmly, they often negotiate quietly," or "While tensions are high, direct conflict is avoided," help learners express complex relationships clearly and accurately.
Controlled tension also highlights the difference between perception and reality, because while headlines may suggest that countries are on the verge of war, the actual interactions between governments often involve negotiation, compromise, and adherence to agreements. And by recognizing this contrast, learners can see how language shapes understanding of international events.
Moreover, countries sometimes signal strength publicly to reassure their own populations or to influence rivals, although behind the scenes they may be engaging in careful diplomacy, which shows the importance of distinguishing between rhetoric used for domestic or international audiences and the concrete actions taken to maintain stability.
The concept of controlled tension also applies to economic and political measures, such as sanctions, trade restrictions, or military exercises, because while these actions demonstrate seriousness and capability, they are often calibrated to avoid triggering open war, and learners can use this example to understand cause and effect relationships and conditional language in English.
For instance, sentences like, "While sanctions increase pressure on the target country, they also create challenges for allies," or, "Although military exercises are provocative, they do not necessarily indicate imminent war," provide models for expressing contrast and nuance, which are valuable skills for discussing complex global issues in English.
It is also important to note that international relations involve multiple actors with overlapping interests, because while one country may push aggressively for its goals, others may act as mediators, observers, or restraining influences, and the resulting network of interactions often stabilizes tension, demonstrating that conflict management is a collective effort rather than the responsibility of a single state.
Understanding the combination of public rhetoric, private diplomacy, and strategic calculation helps learners see why tensions between major powers do not automatically escalate into war, because leaders are aware of long-term consequences, economic costs, and human risks, and this awareness shapes decision-making even in seemingly volatile situations.
For English learners, this is an opportunity to practice expressing cause, consequence, and contrast, using structures like although, while, however, and despite, because these words allow learners to connect ideas logically, describe conflicting perspectives, and convey nuanced understanding of real-world issues.
By studying how controlled tension works, learners also develop critical thinking skills, because they learn to question whether dramatic media narratives accurately reflect reality, whether statements represent actual policy or strategic signaling, and how countries navigate complex international environments while minimizing the risk of unintended escalation.
Ultimately, recognizing that the world operates through a combination of negotiation, deterrence, diplomacy, and strategic signaling allows learners to follow global news calmly, discuss international issues accurately, and apply advanced English structures to express nuanced ideas about risk, responsibility, and conflict management.
This understanding prepares listeners for the next part of our discussion, because once we see how tension is managed, it becomes possible to explore potential outcomes, the role of smaller countries in the global system, and how decisions made by leaders like Trump, Putin, and Zelensky interact with diplomacy to shape the overall balance of power.
By combining vocabulary knowledge, contrast structures, and real-world examples, learners can develop confidence in both their English skills and their ability to interpret international events critically, which is exactly the kind of analytical thinking we want to cultivate on the English globe, while maintaining calm, educational discussion.
Even when conflicts and strategic tensions occur far from our homes, their consequences can reach everyday people in practical ways, because rising global uncertainty often affects the economy, influencing the price of fuel, food, and basic goods, which can create noticeable changes in household budgets, travel costs, and even the affordability of education. And understanding these connections helps learners see that geopolitics is relevant to daily life.
That is correct, Adam. And students and workers may feel these effects indirectly, because when countries experience instability, markets respond with changes in energy costs, commodity prices, and currency fluctuations, which may lead to higher expenses for families, adjustments in job opportunities, or altered plans for study abroad, showing that global tension has both visible and subtle effects on ordinary life.
For example, if oil prices increase due to international uncertainty, transportation costs rise, which affects commuting, shipping, and the cost of goods. And this in turn impacts families, businesses, and public services, illustrating that global events are connected to everyday decisions and expenditures, even when they occur thousands of kilometers away from where people live.
Similarly, food prices are influenced by global supply chains and energy costs, because production, shipping, and storage all depend on stable trade and transportation. So when international tensions affect logistics or raise the cost of inputs, the result is often higher prices at local markets, which shows learners that economic stability is closely tied to global events.
Job markets are another area influenced by geopolitical developments, because businesses respond to uncertainty by delaying investments, reducing expansion plans, or adjusting hiring, which can affect workers, students entering the workforce, and people considering career changes, demonstrating that even indirect global events can influence local employment conditions and economic security.
Education is also affected, especially for students planning international studies, because visa processing, scholarship availability, and travel safety depend on global stability, and when countries face tension or sanctions, educational programs may be delayed, relocated, or cancelled, which shows learners that geopolitics can influence long-term planning for personal development.
By observing these practical impacts, we can see why understanding geopolitics helps people become informed global citizens, because awareness of international events allows individuals to anticipate changes in markets, policy, and social conditions, make better decisions for their careers and families, and interpret news without unnecessary fear or exaggeration.
English learners can also benefit from this discussion by learning and practicing vocabulary related to global impact, such as economy, stability, uncertainty, and impact, because these words are commonly used in news reports, discussions of international affairs, and explanations of how worldwide events influence daily life in calm and factual ways.
It is also useful for learners to notice cause and effect relationships in these examples, because linking words like because, as a result, and therefore help explain how global tension affects fuel prices, job opportunities, education, and daily decisions, allowing learners to describe complex phenomena clearly and confidently in English.
Finally, understanding the practical effects of global tension encourages critical thinking, because it helps learners recognize that while international conflicts may seem distant or abstract, they have concrete consequences on personal finances, travel plans, education, and work. And learners can use this insight to participate in discussions about global issues responsibly and accurately.
By combining knowledge of international affairs with vocabulary, cause and effect structures, and clear explanations, learners can approach news and educational content with calm, analytical understanding, which builds both English proficiency and awareness of how global events connect to everyday life, without unnecessary worry or fear.
This perspective emphasizes that being informed does not mean being anxious, but rather being able to understand the links between global stability and personal experience, allowing learners to use English to describe real-world problems, explain consequences, and communicate ideas about complex topics in a professional and composed manner.
When learners engage with real global crises, such as international tensions, economic uncertainty, or conflicts, they gain a unique opportunity to improve English listening and comprehension, because following discussions about current events exposes students to formal vocabulary, structured arguments, and sentence patterns that appear repeatedly in news media, official statements, and educational podcasts, allowing learners to connect language study with real-world context.
That is very true, Adam, because listening to topics like geopolitics, economics, and international relations provides exposure to formal academic English, which differs from casual conversation in structure, vocabulary, and tone. And by studying these materials carefully, learners develop the ability to understand complex ideas, summarize information, and discuss important issues clearly in English.
Long podcasts, like the ones we create on the English Globe, are particularly effective for improving fluency and confidence, because extended listening encourages learners to process information at a natural pace, recognize sentence connectors, identify repeated patterns, and gradually build the ability to understand longer, more complex sentences without feeling lost or overwhelmed.
For example, learners can focus on expressions of cause and consequence, contrast structures, and conditional language, because these forms frequently appear in discussions about international crises. And by noticing how we model clear, slow, and natural English, students can practice pronunciation, intonation, and comprehension, which strengthens both their listening and speaking skills simultaneously.
Another important benefit of using global crises as learning material is that it encourages critical thinking, because learners are not only processing vocabulary and grammar, but also evaluating evidence, considering different perspectives, and connecting events to consequences in a logical way, which enhances their ability to discuss topics analytically while using English accurately.
When learners pay attention to how we describe events calmly and factually, they also learn to adopt a professional tone in English, because observing how to explain sensitive topics without exaggeration or fear teaches them how to communicate responsibly, which is especially important in academic discussions, debates, and formal presentations.
Vocabulary acquisition is another key advantage, because words like tension, stability, influence, diplomacy, and consequence are repeatedly used in discussions of global crises, and learners can practice understanding these words in context, using them in their own sentences, and recognizing subtle differences in meaning, which is much more effective than learning vocabulary in isolation.
Podcasts also help learners practice listening comprehension, because they allow repeated exposure to natural speech, intonation, and transitional phrases, and by following long explanations about international relations or strategic decisions, students can train their ears to detect sentence boundaries, conjunctions, and emphasis, improving overall understanding of spoken English.
It is also beneficial for learners to imitate clear and slow English, as we model in this podcast, because this approach provides a bridge between understanding written English and comprehending spoken English in real time, which gradually increases confidence, reduces stress, and makes learners more comfortable participating in conversations or discussions on complex topics.
Finally, using global crises as learning material helps learners develop the ability to connect language with real-world knowledge, because understanding events, causes, and consequences improves comprehension, allows discussion in meaningful contexts, and encourages learners to express opinions in English that are informed, logical, and articulate, combining language skills with critical awareness.
By integrating global news, vocabulary, structured explanations, and calm analysis, learners not only improve English proficiency, but also gain insight into how the world works, which allows them to participate thoughtfully in discussions, read and understand news critically, and apply advanced English skills in academic, professional, and personal settings.
In conclusion, following global crises through podcasts, news discussions, and educational materials provides English learners with comprehensive training, because it simultaneously develops vocabulary, grammar, comprehension, fluency, and critical thinking, while modeling how to communicate complex topics clearly, accurately, and responsibly, which is the ultimate goal of learning English through real-world content.
As we conclude today's episode, it is important to reflect on the main points we have covered, because understanding the roles of key leaders such as Trump, Putin, and Zelensky helps us see how global tension develops, while also clarifying that tension, uncertainty, and disagreement between countries do not automatically lead to a full-scale world war, demonstrating that diplomacy, strategy, and careful communication remain central to international relations.
Exactly, Adam. And when we consider Trump's influence, we recognize how public rhetoric, strong statements, and policy decisions can shape alliances, influence perceptions, and create uncertainty, while still being part of a broader strategic framework in which actual military engagement is carefully managed, allowing learners to appreciate the distinction between words, intentions, and real-world outcomes.
Looking at Putin and Russia, we explored how historical experience, concerns about sovereignty, and long-term strategy affect decisions regarding borders, alliances, and influence. And by understanding concepts like deterrence, diplomacy, and stability, learners can see that countries act from calculated reasoning, not only reaction or aggression, which adds depth to discussions about global crises.
Turning to Zelensky and Ukraine, we emphasized how smaller countries navigate the pressures of major powers, seek support from allies, and make decisions that balance survival with independence, while also considering the human, political, and economic consequences of prolonged conflict, providing learners with concrete examples of cause, consequence, and responsibility in real-world English discussions.
We also examined the role of media, sensationalism, and perception, because terms like narrative, exaggeration, and credibility help learners understand how reporting shapes public understanding and why careful analysis is essential when interpreting headlines about World War III or other alarming events, allowing students to improve critical reading and listening skills in formal English contexts.
In addition, we highlighted controlled tension and diplomacy, explaining that although global conflicts may seem dramatic, back-channel communication, multilateral negotiations, and strategic signaling all help major powers manage disputes without direct confrontation, demonstrating how structured reasoning and careful decision-making are key to maintaining stability even during periods of uncertainty.
Throughout this episode, learners have encountered vocabulary that is highly useful for discussing international affairs, including tension, uncertainty, stability, influence, sovereignty, deterrence, diplomacy, narrative, credibility, exaggeration, consequence, and impact. And by recognizing these words in context, students can build both comprehension and practical usage in discussions about global issues.
We encourage learners to continue listening to long English podcasts because extended exposure allows practice with natural speech, complex sentences, and advanced structures, improving fluency, comprehension, and confidence, and providing the opportunity to apply formal, academic vocabulary while following real-world examples that are informative, calm, and fact-based.
By connecting language learning with global awareness, students gain more than vocabulary and grammar. They develop critical thinking, the ability to summarize complex situations, and confidence in discussing international events in English, all while observing clear, slow, and natural dialogue modeled by speakers who prioritize clarity, neutrality, and analytical explanation.
In summary, this episode has shown that understanding global tension involves recognizing the roles of leaders, analyzing actions versus rhetoric, interpreting media narratives critically, and appreciating the importance of diplomacy, stability, and strategic thinking. And by engaging with this content, learners are able to strengthen their language skills while gaining insight into the interconnected world we live in today.
As you continue your English learning journey, remember that listening carefully, reflecting on meaning, and applying vocabulary in context will gradually increase your comprehension and fluency, and that by observing real-world examples like Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, you can understand not only language, but also how international relations shape everyday life, decisions, and perspectives across the globe.
Finally, we hope that this episode has provided both language practice and global understanding in a calm, professional, and educational way, encouraging learners to remain curious, attentive, and confident, and to see English not only as a means of communication, but also as a tool to explore, analyze, and discuss the complex world around us thoughtfully and accurately.